Всем доброе утро. Сейчас для нас выступит Дэн Грининг с темой Leadership Patterns. То есть, смотрите, Дэн проделал огромную работу. Фактически, что он сделал? Он взял все практики, которые смог вспомнить, Scrum, Kanban и так далее, вывалил их на один большой-большой mindmap и попытался найти там что-то, какое-то ядро, да, вот что как бы вот в Agile, в Kanban самое главное. И выделил 5 таких вот паттернов. И вы знаете, мне кажется, ему в достаточно большой степени удалось это сделать, но он сейчас сам вам об этом расскажет.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Today we're going to talk about Agile base patterns. This has been some research that I have been doing over the past year to try to understand what is Agile really. Fundamentally, why do we do Agile things? What purpose does it serve? And the reason I started this exercise was because I wanted to understand Agile organizations. I deal with large organizations, and I wanted to know, is this organization Agile? Why would it be Agile? Why does it want to be Agile? And what is the purpose of a manager? What is the purpose of a team? What is the purpose of a department? These questions bothered me. Because I thought in the Agile community, we don't have very good answers, or did not have very good answers then about, are we Agile? I saw lots of questions like that, and the answers that I saw were lame, not very good. So this is me. My name is Dan Greening. I am an Agile coach based effectively worldwide. I'm the managing director of a consulting firm that deals with agility. The people that are involved with Cenex Rex are largely analytical people who like metrics and like to understand large companies. I have a certification called Certified Scrum Coach. You might think, because that is something from the Scrum Alliance, that we would emphasize Scrum. This particular certification does not really emphasize Scrum. We are very interested in Kanban and XP and all sorts of things, because we have to go into companies and we deal with a variety of problems in those companies for a longer period of time than a trainer would. So that is why we have to study everything. Previously, I was the head coach for Skype. So that was a worldwide exercise. There are 7 locations that Skype has development offices. Before that, I was the head coach for Citrix Online, which too has many offices throughout the world. Previous to that, I founded 3 startups, and 2 of them were quite successful. One of them was not successful. So that failure of that startup company said, I'm not invincible. I need to understand more about what projects, how do I make sure that projects work first, because I was an engineer from the beginning. I was interested in managing engineering. And then I realized I also had to worry about whether my product was suitable for the market. So I started studying Scrum, XP, Lean Kanban, and Lean Startup. So Lean Startup is for product managers or product owners. And through that study, I became one of these. I didn't intend to go here. This was just an exploration to fix a problem that I thought I had. And then I realized that I had some contributions to make to others. My background before that was I was a researcher. I have a PhD in computer science from UCLA, and it is in the field of chaos and complexity theory. So it turns out that Agile has a lot to do with that. So I mentioned my motivations. Why did lean and Agile methodologies arise? And I hope in this talk to provide you some background about that. And I wanted to understand what patterns do they share? What are they about? Why do organizations fail to sustain agility? You might not know this. You might think that Agile, maybe 5 years ago, I remember hearing lots of colleagues of mine talk about how Agile just was common sense. And then, but, common sense is not common. I thought that was kind of silly. In fact, it is not easy to maintain agility, especially if you don't know why you're doing it. If you're doing it because it's a fad or because all your competitors are doing it and it scares you if you're not Agile, that's probably not enough reason to adopt it because it costs a lot to be Agile. People who tell you it's cheaper, they're probably not really telling you the whole truth because organizations adopt Agile practices and larger organizations lose it. A lot of them. I would say probably 2/3 of companies that adopt Agile practices in about 3 or 4 years, they adopt Agile practices, they can ship every month or so, and then 2-3 years later, many of them are shipping every 6 months, every 9 months. That's not very Agile. So what characteristics do Agile managers share? That is something that we want to understand as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk way back in the old days. So Toyota versus GM. So Toyota was one of the first Agile companies, and GM was a giant car manufacturer back in the 50s. Toyota, after it went through World War II and then started having, wanting to work and deliver only 500 cars a year. There was a period where Toyota almost went bankrupt and it was just shipping a few cars a year. It had to do, through economics, it had to do something called just in time. So someone orders a car and then they say, oh gosh, we better put together all the parts. It's all very pull-based, and you're familiar with that because of the emphasis in this conference on Kanban. So the name of this went from just-in-time manufacturing to Toyota Production System, and now to lean manufacturing to describe it throughout the industry. So General Motors, on the other hand, did something different. It did forecast and inventory. So the general idea there is it was selling so many cars, it looked to the market and said, we think this is going to be the number of small cars people are going to want. We think this is the number of trucks. We think this is the number of SUVs. And then they would forecast and then they would inventory those cars. They would build the cars. The idea there is that GM could manage its inventory by changing pricing and driving more demand. But the problem is, you can imagine, that if they build too many trucks and then there isn't really demand for trucks, you could lower the price for trucks a long way before people would start to buy them. So Toyota had a culture of continuous improvement. Everybody was encouraged to look for problems, identify them, and bring them to the attention of managers who would then work with those people to construct solutions. General Motors had a bunch of contracts that dictated exactly what people would do. This was not just union laborers who had contracts like this. There were also car dealers. There was also suppliers. Everybody had these very detailed contracts because contracts were important for General Motors to be able to produce the inventory they produced. Toyota had a policy of top-down value alignment. What I mean by that is at the very top of the organization, they would decide what Toyota's goals were, and then they would ask all the departments how they could support those goals to construct their own goals so that the entire company was aligned around one thing. General Motors, on the other hand, had plant managers who were given enormous autonomy, the ability to decide how things were done in the plant. And they often would sabotage things that the high leaders want. They would sabotage the larger goals of General Motors to serve their purposes. Toyota had a sense of collective responsibility. When a car went out of the manufacturing line, everyone on the factory floor felt it was their responsibility to provide a great car to the customer. General Motors, on the other hand, had role-based responsibility, where they said that if you are supposed to put that part on that lever, then you just do that well, and everything will be fine. Toyota had a concept called respect for people, which doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. It means that people are smart. People can adapt. People can solve problems. People can think. And so what we should do with our people is put them in situations where they think. And what we should do with all the other type of work is we should automate it. So they constructed this term, autonomation. General Motors, on the other hand, had this notion of people that they were based on classes. So if you go to General Motors headquarters, it's in a beautiful building in Detroit. It's still beautiful. I was just there 4 months ago. And that is where the executives are, right? They aren't in the factory. They're actually off somewhere else, making their decisions in a little vacuum over there. Well, of course, we know what the answer to this was. Toyota became the most profitable car company in the world, and it did that not by being the volume leader. It did not make more cars than General Motors, which is not too surprising. Since General Motors makes these forecasts and inventories things, it's going to make more cars than it really needs to solve the problems of its customers. And in turn, General Motors went bankrupt in 2007. So I construct this contrast because it will help us think about agile practices as well. So in the 1980s, we had a problem with software project failures. So this data you see on the left, which you might be able to read, is from an article called Why Software Fails by Charette in IEEE Spectrum 2005. Here it details a set of software failures that made it to the news for several years from 1992 to 2005. That list shows that every year we see somewhere between $500 million, so that would be, I don't know how many rubles that is. So $500 million to, some cases, $2.6 billion. So $3.4 billion of software failure cost. And what do I mean by these software failures? Is it just that we started this software project and then it didn't quite work the way we want to? No, it was a real failure, meaning that once it got done, people tried to use it, they couldn't use it, and the software was abandoned. So all of that work, $3.4 billion worth of work that could have gone to helping people with food in poor countries, or could help people build dams or wind farms or all sorts of things, instead was squandered by these software companies, by us. So that bothered some people in the 1980s, and they said, what should we do? Here's some characteristics of the practice that they were doing before, which was to start a project at the beginning. When you start the project, you plan everything up front, and then you complete it in phases. So you prototype stuff, you do the development, you do the testing, you package the software, and you deploy it over maybe 18 months. So that is called waterfall. And this is the results from waterfall projects in 2011. So these projects are still happening. Perhaps half of the software projects that we think about are actually done this way. So this is the failure rate for waterfall in 2011. 29% of these software projects are never put into place and spent their entire budget. All right? 57% of these projects are challenged, meaning that they are late or we had to put more money into them, but they were ultimately solving a problem and they were put into use. 14% were considered complete successes. So that is the state of waterfall, and that is why we started thinking about other options. So when we started thinking about other options, we said, we'll pay a lot of money to try to solve this problem. What should we do? We're okay if we pay something for that. And what we did was Agile. So Agile has a cost. Instead of releasing once every 18 months, we're releasing more frequently, maybe once a month. So when we release once a month, there's a cost for that. We have to put an entire structure around shipping, testing, repeatedly over a period of 18 months. So 18 times we have to test, package, ship. That's a cost. But it turns out that there was a benefit to that, and that is that instead of 14% of these projects being successful, we had 42%, 3 times as many. And the number of complete failures went from 30% to 1/3 of that, 9%. And the rest are in this challenged category. So this turned out to be a great benefit. But it's only really a benefit if you do Agile practices well. So what is Agile? So what do we see in this, in all of these Agile practices, and why are they there? Well, agility tells you what it is in its name. So the Agile word kind of gives you an idea. We want to be able to sense what's happening to us. So in Scrum, in production methods, we want to sense what's happening in the development organization. In the product management group, if we're adopting something called lean startup, we are sensing the market on a regular basis, and we're understanding what's happening right now. We are adapting to what we see. We put practices in place where we actually change what we do based on what we see. And then finally, we create something. We create something. So these 3 things, well, of course, we do all these 3 things in a waterfall project, but here is what is really the crux of Agile. We do it faster than our economy changes. So if you are a mathematician, you can use, we can talk about chaos theory a little bit, but the general idea is economies are chaotic. And since economies are chaotic, we have to do things that work well in chaos. So here is what chaos looks like. So chaos says chaotic systems are systems where you can tell what's going to happen in the near term. You can tell that maybe in 2 weeks, people will hit your website, you know, maybe 10% more or 10% less, right? You can kind of predict that with some accuracy, but you can't really predict how many people are going to hit your website 6 months from now, 9 months from now? That's because chaotic systems, our forecasts are inaccurate, become more inaccurate exponentially with time. The more time we have, the worse our estimates are going to be. So planning up front makes some sense for short-term activities, but does not make sense for long-term activities. And so that's where Agile wins. So I took all of these Agile all Agile methodologies I could think of, which were Scrum, XP, Lean Kanban, even Pomodoro and getting things done and Lean Startup. And I said, let's take all of the practices, all of the artifacts, all of the roles in these different things and cluster them. So I took all of them and I basically threw hundreds of practices and artifacts kind of out on a mind map and said, where do these belong? And I moved them around and I tried to see what was similar about them. And I clustered them into 5 patterns. So it's important to talk about what a pattern is. A pattern is something that says, when we have this problem, what are the forces that constrain a solution? And if those are the forces that constrain our solution, what is the solution? So a pattern is a way of writing about something. So if you go to Agile, most Agile documents will tell you what to do, but they might not tell you why you had to do it. And I don't like that because I want people to be motivated to do it when it's important to do it, and I want them not to feel constrained to do it when there's no good reason to do it. If you don't need Agile, you shouldn't do it. It's expensive. So here is a pattern. And the first thing I'm going to say is what the problem is. Fixed budget creativity often fails. So if you create a fixed budget for a creative activity, it can fail. It often fails. So let's talk a little bit about why people are creative, especially in the business environment. They're creative because they are trying to win through innovation. They're trying to beat competitors, and they're working in an economy. So economies are not just about money. They're actually about anything that has limited resources, and you're trying to produce value. So even a family is an economy. Each of you in the family has a limited amount of time, a limited amount of attention to spend with different people in the family. And so you need to broker those limited resources to help achieve what you want, which is happiness for everyone, or a more coherent family, or future financial health. So economics drives everything we do. And then the forces around that are, well, the success metrics that we normally think about for economies usually lag the work by a long time. So the stock price or the profitability of a company is going to lag your innovation by a long time. Risk is rarely measured. We often avoid thinking about risk. And then creativity, particularly in this space, it generates variation. So if you're trying to, many manufacturing-focused Kanban type folks actually they don't realize this, or they don't incorporate it into their thinking, and they drive creativity out of their system. So 3M, for example, was a highly innovative company based in the United States, and it started applying TQM, total quality management, not only to their manufacturing processes, where variation is really a problem, but also to their creative endeavors. And what happened was they drove creativity out of their business. They haven't done anything very interesting in a while. it was a disaster. So something to think about. So therefore, since we have this problem, fixed budget creativity often fails, then let's make sure that we measure our progress as we go. So in order to measure our progress as we go, we need something called a leading indicator. We need to know, how's our productivity going? How's our quality going? How's our communication within our team? Will we be successful? So the first thing you do as a company, as you have to identify your top level goals, what are the customers we're trying to serve? By serving them, what value will they obtain from us? And then once we have that information, we can actually construct a company, we can construct departments that serve that purpose. And so alignment of these goals throughout a company is very important. But it's all really about metrics. So here's an example of leading indicators. So the red line is our variable of interest. And you can see over time, it is lagging the leading indicator, which is this other line. They're not exactly correlated. They are, we can't be certain that going up will necessarily lead to a good result later. Sometimes it doesn't. So this is going way down. And then, well, it does go down here. It's mostly going down. It's mostly going up. That's a nice leading indicator, but it's not perfect. So none of these leading indicators are perfect. So there you have it. So when we construct metrics, we have a problem, especially with leading indicator metrics. We have something called perversity. So if you have a Scrum team, for example, that is tracking its velocity, and it thinks that that's the only metric that it needs to track, I know what happens. I've seen it many, many times. They drive their velocity higher and the bug count goes up. Because there's cost to, there's cost to fixing bugs. And so since we're only measuring how much code we produce or how much code we ship, then we end up shipping a lot of code that has a lot of story points associated with it, if that's how you count it. And so that metric alone is a perverse metric. But in fact, virtually every metric that you just say, we're trying to drive towards this one metric, the first thing you should think is probably perverse, okay? So if you're tracking bug count and that's all you're doing, you're not going to produce very much code because every piece of code that you produce increases the risk that you're going to fail. So the other thing to remember about metrics is they have to evolve. So metrics that you start out with in a startup company, for example, you'll be worrying about how many people hit your site, how many people try the system. But later on, you'll want to know economics, how many people are actually buying your product, ultimately how much profit are you making. So those metrics will change over time. So what happens when we measure economic progress? If we just apply this one pattern to an organization or a team, we get a coherent company because our vision, our mission, and our goals are all aligned through the company. Our employee and team behavior is all contributing towards the company's success. And if the economy isn't really changing much, if it's sort of stable, we can react to new events, we can learn about stuff, we can forecast, all based on our leading metrics. So then I said, well, there's a bunch of stuff in Agile practices, like velocity, which is a metric. There's bug count, which is a metric. There's the sprint length, which is another metric. There's a lot of metrics in Agile. So if all we do is the metrics part of Agile, are we Agile? Well, no. We can't react fast enough to really satisfy the market. So reacting is not enough. We can't just monitor what's happening with us. We can't just react to whatever crazy thing the market is doing at the time. We could be this guy here sitting on a train track because, a train hasn't come over here for the last day or two. I'm just going to hang out here and read the paper, right? That is what happened to a bunch of bankrupt companies, including Kodak. So Kodak went bankrupt because it thought film would continue to have demand. There were certain obscure areas where film was better than digital imaging. And they kind of said, well, people are still buying our stuff. We're still going to do our thing. And of course, they went bankrupt a few years ago. So instead, we have to proactively experiment. So what we do is we brainstorm new ideas that might improve how we're dealing with our market or discover a new market. And when we do that, we first have to brainstorm, we have to construct a hypothesis, we have to test the hypothesis by a controlled experiment. And with that experiment, we can then evolve. So we talk about Kaizen in lean Kanban. Kaizen is an evolutionary method for adapting. And it doesn't necessarily find the giant wins. So we also have to think about revolutionary theories too. The problem with revolutionary theories is that they have a high risk. And so one of the things you have to do when you're thinking about revolution is you have to try to control risk. So you have to test your theories in the small before you take over a whole, try to address a whole giant new market. And then again, beware of variability control. You do not want to kill creativity in an innovation group. So because I thought retrospectives were really important, this was before I did this research, I actually realized that the retrospective's purpose was to set up an experiment in Scrum. It's the first meeting of Scrum, actually, so it's right here. And what do? We look at the metrics from before, what was our velocity, what was our quality, and then we reflect on that based on the process that we had before, and then we brainstorm about new theories we might have for the team, and we construct an experiment, and once we construct the experiment, we say to the Scrum Master, your primary responsibility now that the experiment is started, now that we started the planning meeting, your primary purpose is to control the experiment. We made a decision about what the ready criteria was, the done criteria, and all that stuff. And now we just want to make sure that the team follows through on its commitments through the end of the sprint so that when we get these metrics are associated with something solid, a new process that we decided to do. So hopefully you too will agree that the retrospective is the very first meeting of a sprint. And the funny thing is, I was speaking on this topic in Agile 2015 just a few months ago with Jeff Sutherland, and I made this claim, and then in front of all these people, he said I had convinced him that the retrospective was the first meeting of Scrum. So hopefully you will find it that way too. Experiments seek, when you do an experiment, what you should seek is a 50% invalidation rate. So this is something that Don Reinertson really introduced to me, which was the idea is that if we're getting 100% of our experiments invalidated, then we're really not learning a lot. And that happens when managers construct stretch goals that teams really can't achieve, as if that will motivate them to improve. Maybe it has a little motivation, but when you miss your stretch goal every single time, you learn that it doesn't matter. You'll never satisfy that boss. Then you also get this other problem on the other side, 100% validated experiments. This happens when Agile is for the team. We have decided that we're going to keep our velocity goals low so that we can constantly achieve them. 100% success. That usually means you're learning nothing. So if you want to be creative, you really have to learn stuff. So the result of experimentation is actually been studied. We get hyper-productive teams. So Carson Jacobson and Jeff Sutherland studied this at a company called Systematic Corporation. They got 100% faster production, twice the speed. And then they got 40% higher quality through these teams when they ran these regular experiments. The problem is that organizations disrupt themselves when they're doing this, which makes it a little bit uncomfortable. So are we agile if we proactively experiment to improve? Well, we might not do it fast enough, right? Especially in this fast-moving market. So there's more to come. It turns out that high utilization is a subject that we're all familiar with in Lean Kanban. It creates delay. And why are we doing that? How does that emerge? Well, what happens, the forces that are affecting us is we feel better if everybody's busy. If everybody's busy, we think that we've got a good company, it's really rolling, everybody's busy, we're going to be successful. But we discover, why can't stuff get done on time? Well, it doesn't get done on time because of congestion. So the problem is, if things are highly utilized and we're making random requests of a system, and then we start hitting it if it can do one thing every day. And on average, we hit it with a request every day. What you get is something that skyrockets. The queue skyrockets. So this is why we do Kanban and why we do WIP limits in Kanban, is to avoid this type of congestion. Going home at 6 p.m. in Bangkok is dumb, right? This is what happens at 6 p.m. in Bangkok. You wait forever in this big line. But I show this to people and I say, hey, can you tell me which side of this highway is faster? And they look at it and then they say, first they say, well, they both suck. They're both slow. And then they say, well, the one on this side is faster. And I say, that's what I think too. And everybody ends up thinking that. And the reason they think that is because there's space, right? It's not 100% saturated over there where it is over on the other side. So another thing that we should think about with respect to utilization is our own cognition. There's only so much that we can consider at one time and actually make good decisions. This was studied back in the 50s by a guy named George Miller. He constructed this idea that in every sort of cognitive sense, we can remember somewhere between we remember between 5 and 9 things with some fidelity. And then if we have to remember more than 9 things, we lose track of those things. So that's interesting. What does that mean? Well, that means something cognitive for your product owner. If you have more than 7 items in your sprint backlog, it's probably a mistake, okay? It's a mistake because you can't consider all of the 7 different options of what to do easily and decide which thing is the most important. So when we try to remember, when we look at, for example, a list of backlog items, and we have 5 backlog items in our backlog, and then we have this person turn around and then try to remember what are the things in the backlog, they'll be able to remember 5 things. They'll remember all of those things. So when we get to 6 and we have them turn around, about 85% will not be able to remember one of those things, or they'll get them out of order. And then at 7, we start to get a failure rate of about 70%. So this tells us, I think, that we need to be conscious of cognition within our system. And I think David Anderson referred to that, which I appreciated, that we really have to think about our own cognitive limits. Incremental production has a tendency to be able to reduce, to help us make decisions. And so this we're in a situation where we build a tire. We're trying to help people transport themselves from one side of the city to another. We build a tire and we hand it to our customer, and of course they're mad because the tire doesn't do anything. We give them a chassis with the tires, and that doesn't do anything for them either, getting across town, and that doesn't do anything for them, especially if they're in a rainy country. And then finally, if we give them a roof, they can make it across town. So in this case, when we start, we have a skateboard. It gets them across town faster. It's still not great. We give them a handle for their skateboard, and it's a little bit better. A bicycle is much better than that. And a motorcycle is way better, and then, of course, a car is better. So if we can ship in this progress, we simultaneously limit the amount of work in process we're doing, where our sunk cost is no longer sunk once we ship this thing. So that is our result of limiting work in process. If we limit work in process in our group, we're going to be delivering small increments of value. We can get feedback, that we can cancel the work as soon as we satisfy the customer sufficiently. We learn faster than the chaotic economy changes. But what else do? We manage the number of options we're thinking about. We keep the number of items in our sprint backlog low. And actually, I think we construct something else called a geometric backlog to deal with longer-term thinking. We don't consider 20 different project options that are going to last a quarter. We narrow that down to more like 7. So with these 3 patterns, are we agile? I think we are. If we do these 3 patterns, I think you can sense what's happening in the market. You can adapt your processes to match that, and you can produce new work that addresses their needs fast enough to meet the economic chaos. The problem is that when people adopt these practices, it's very hard to maintain. So you can construct a company that has a fixed set of testers, a fixed set of developers, a database person, et cetera, and you can give them all roles just the way General Motors did, and you can accomplish all 3 of these things. Okay? It will work as long as you construct the right complement of people for the demand that you're going to currently have. The problem is the demand changes. The problem is the type of people, the type of markets that you're going to address are going to evolve. And so let's go a little further than that. Let's try to keep our agility a little longer. So one thing that I discovered, and many of us have discovered, is people create delay by avoiding responsibility. So what I mean by that is something that Christopher Avery promotes, the idea of a responsibility process. So when we have a success, we never have a problem taking responsibility for something. We never have a problem associating ourselves with that project. We wrote a couple of lines about that in our newsletter, and therefore I wrote something about that in our newsletter, and therefore I was associated with this awesome product that made millions of dollars, billions of dollars. So we don't ever have a problem with that. The problem, where we have problems, is when there's a failure. So can we take responsibility for that? Say, yes, I was associated with that project that lost $2 billion. I wrote about it in our newsletter as if it were awesome, right? So no, we don't do that. We always go through a sequence to reach that point, though. What we do is we blame other people for the problem, and then we say, well, we were associated with it. We did work in that company. And then we say, well, this is just the nature of the companies. They have failures, and failures are just the way it is sometimes in companies. Or then we say, I did write about that, and I did tell everyone in the company how awesome it was, and they all rallied around and tried to help do that and didn't work on other projects that could have been more profitable. I suck. I'm a bad person. So we get stuck in this shame place where we actually don't do anything to fix anything in the future. We just feel like I don't know why I did that, I'm so dumb, right? And then finally we move on beyond something called obligation to responsibility, where we say, yes, I was associated with it, but I did see certain problems. What would I do in the future? And we make decisions about how we'll act in the future. If we can get to that state of responsibility about anything we're associated with we can help accelerate the fixing problems. No problems get solved until someone takes responsibility. And in this pattern, in teams, we say collective responsibility is best. So collective responsibility is where we provide people with enough autonomy, understanding, and authority to actually take responsibility and fix things themselves within a team. This is why we do in Scrum this idea of self-organizing teams, where we allow everyone to, we say, you are responsible for the collective output of the team. I don't think we say that strongly enough, because we still have developers and testers in teams who have that role and think their sole responsibility is to test the system. Their sole responsibility is to develop for that system. And what happens is they are slower. That team is slower as a result of that constraint. So if we do this, we're going to teach the responsibility and we're going to get faster output. We will be more elastic if we do this. So we will start to have this notion that, yes, you're giving us a lot more database demand. We are going to learn how to do database, and other people in the team are going to learn this. And when we learn this, we'll be able to adapt to new demands. Our in-team collaboration improves and we learn a lot more. So are we agile? Well, we are more agile. We're more sustainably agile. So we're more sustainably agile. There's one more thing that we have, which is a problem in agile, and that is people outside our team affect our agility. So we are waiting for people. We're waiting for other teams. We're waiting for the approval of a boss. We sometimes get buggy stuff that comes to us. We have to test that, and then we find out there's a horrible bug, and we have to send it back. So there's all sorts of problems when we have dependencies, especially if the teams we're dealing with are not agile. And so what do we do with that? We actually have to convert our bosses to be agile. We have to have them think about the lead time for projects that they are responsible for. We have to build collaborative teams of peer managers to deal with each other, to manage strategic work together. So you can manage strategic work with Scrum. I do this all the time. Jeff Sutherland does this all the time. Lots of people do this. You can also do it with Kanban. So while I start out with Scrum. I'll give you an example. I changed the way we recruited new people at Citrix Online. And I did it first with a Scrum team of fellow managers. So we had, actually it was a project that we were doing, but it wasn't the only project. But we said, we want to improve recruiting. That was a backlog item. And then we said, well, we are working together. What should we do? And then we decided we should use Kanban for recruiting. It was perfectly suited for that. And we actually started recruiting through a Kanban board, and it turned out to be great. But we did it with all the practices that I've showed you here. We actually did incrementalism. We started with one job posting, and we started getting the system working with that, and then we expanded it to 2, and then we taught the HR department how to do it, and it changed the structure of our HR process. So I have this diagram, but I'm not going to show it. Well, I'll show it a little bit. This is a diagram of teams in a large company, and these are areas. So if you think about it,